Forget Prince Charming. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on what it was really like to be a medieval prince, and let me tell you, it was less about fairy tale castles, and more about a lifelong game of Russian roulette, played with plagues, poisons, and pointy objects. If you were born a royal, your first act probably should have been to demand a refund on the whole life experience. Your birth certificate wasn't a ticket to luxury, it was a gilt-edged invitation to see how many ways the world could try to kill you before your 10th birthday. So before you drift off into nightmares of dysentery and damp castle walls, do me a solid. If you enjoy this little trip into the darker side of history, hit that like button. And if you're new here and find a strange comfort in learning how truly awful things used to be, consider subscribing. We're on a noble quest for 1,000 subscribers, and every one of you helps. And hey, drop a comment below, and let me know where you're tuning in from. It's always cool to see our global society of history insomniacs. Right then, dim the lights, fluff up your non-louse infested pillow, and let's dive into the rather unfortunate life of you, the medieval prince. Our story, or rather your rather bleak story, begins not with a gentle COO from a doting mother, but with the deafening roar of dynastic expectation. From the moment of your conception, the entire kingdom, your future father the king, and a whole host of perpetually anxious nobles, have been holding their collective breath, desperately hoping that you emerge as a boy. As historical records make painfully clear, a male heir wasn't just a nice-to-have. He was the bedrock of political stability. Anything else, especially a string of daughters, could spell not just disappointment, but a full-blown crisis, potentially plunging the realm into chaos, civil war, or invasions from neighboring kingdoms who smelled weakness like sharks smell blood in the water. Your mother, the queen, bless her probably very uncomfortable, corseted heart, isn't seen in this moment primarily as a mother-to-be. No, in the cold, hard math of medieval power, her main job, her almost only purpose within the court, was to be a royal baby-making machine, specifically for the production of male heirs. It was a high-stakes game, and if she failed to deliver the required boy child, the blame, swift and merciless, would land squarely on her. Such failures were often seen not as a biological roll of the dice, but as a clear sign that God himself wasn't happy with the current royal management, and was withholding his favor. Imagine the sheer, constant pressure. Think of poor Catherine de' Medici, a name that echoes through the halls of queenly desperation. She was so frantic to conceive, so hounded by the need to produce an heir for the French throne, that she reportedly sought out folk healers, and was advised to drink mare's urine and soak her, shall we say, source of life, in a variety of other, equally unappetizing and probably useless, concoctions. The pressure was astronomical, a constant, crushing weight, particularly in kingdoms like France, which was bound by the infamous Salic law. This ancient legal code completely barred women from inheriting the throne. So, if you were a French queen, producing a daughter was, politically speaking, almost as good as producing nothing at all. No pressure, mum, just the fate of the entire dynasty resting on your womb. This intense focus on the queen's reproductive abilities meant that her body, its cycles, its successes, and its failures, were not private matters. They were public political signs, discussed in hushed tones, in private rooms, and shouted in council meetings. Her pregnancies, any miscarriages, and most importantly, the sex of her children, were events that could shift political alliances, spark hope in one group, or fuel bitter despair and plotting in another, both in the court and across the kingdom. A missed period, a rumor of morning sickness, the swell of her belly. These weren't personal health updates, they were bulletins of state importance. The Queen became, in a way, a living measuring stick of the dynasty's future, a constant focus for both intense hope and unbearable pressure. This also meant that you, the potential prince, were a political piece on the board, someone to be talked about and planned around, even before you'd technically been conceived. Your very potential for existence was already shaping the political landscape. Now, let's assume, against some rather grim odds, that your mother has successfully navigated the dangerous waters of conception and pregnancy. The day of your birth arrives. Childbirth for your mother was less a miracle of life, and more like entering a jousting tournament with death himself, armed only with a midwife of questionable sobriety and a lot of prayer, and quite often, death won. Historians estimate that the death rates for both mother and child together were somewhere between a horrifying 30 to 60%. Queens, despite their silks and supposed access to the best care of the time, were not safe from this brutal reality. They died in the birthing bed with shocking regularity. The very act that was meant to secure the dynasty was one of the most dangerous things a royal woman could do. But let's say, through some combination of luck, a strong body, and perhaps a midwife who hadn't hit the mead too hard that morning, both you and your mother survive your grand, and probably incredibly messy, entrance into the world. Don't start celebrating just yet. Don't even think about getting cocky. While exact numbers from the medieval period are notoriously hard to find, a general child mortality rate of around 30% is a commonly accepted estimate, with some historians pushing that figure as high as a terrifying 50%. Many of these tiny, fragile infants died within mere days of their birth, falling to illnesses that modern science has thankfully largely wiped out. Some studies state that about a quarter of all deaths in the medieval period happened within the first year of life. You were, statistically speaking, a long shot. The very air you breathed as a little prince felt hostile, thick with invisible enemies. Common diseases that are now largely preventable or treatable were then common killers of the young. Dysentery, malaria, diphtheria, influenza, typhoid fever, and the dreaded smallpox were the unwelcome, uninvited fairies at your royal christening. There were no miracle drugs, no antibiotics to fight off bacterial infections, no vaccines to prepare your tiny immune system for viral attacks. Your royal blood offered very little protection against these microscopic assassins. A simple fever could be a death sentence. A cough could be the start of your funeral song. And even if you somehow managed to dodge the Grim Reaper's scythe in your perilous first year, the odds didn't get much better. Looking at data from 17th century London, which while a bit later gives us a good idea of city death rates before modern medicine, it's noted that a staggering 36% of babies who survived birth didn't live to see their 6th birthday. And an even more sobering 60% never made it to the ripe old age of 16. So that shiny princely title you were born with, it was less a shield of invincibility, and more a very expensive ermine-trimmed bullseye. This incredibly high rate of infant and child death directly fueled the almost manic pressure on queens to have not just one, but multiple sons. It wasn't just about having an heir, it was about having surviving heirs. The heir and a spare philosophy wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was a grim and practical approach to dynastic survival. The stark reality was that a single male heir, while politically essential, had a huge chance of dying as a baby or a child. Therefore, to secure the future of the dynasty, having multiple boys was a statistical necessity, a way to increase the odds that at least one would make it through the challenges of medieval childhood and live to inherit the throne. This heir and a spare, and maybe even a spare for the spare, mentality wasn't born out of a desire for a big family of boys, but from a brutal, unsentimental understanding of the odds. It meant that even if you were the cherished firstborn prince, your existence was always shadowed by the constant, looming possibility of your own death, and the kingdom's urgent, ongoing need for a replacement. This could subtly or not so subtly affect how much emotional energy was invested by your parents in any single fragile child. You were precious, yes, but also, in a grim way, potentially replaceable. Now let's talk about your grand debut. Your first moments of life, those precious fleeting seconds after you've been successfully pulled from the Queen. Not so private, in fact not private at all. Royal births were essentially public spectacles. It wasn't uncommon for queens to labor and deliver before a real crowd of courtiers. A jostling mix of dukes, duchesses, countesses, barons, and probably some random guy named Geoffrey from accounting, who just wandered in because he heard there might be snacks. Why this rather invasive audience, you ask? It was all about verification and security. The assembled nobles were there to make absolutely sure that no sneaky baby-swapping business occurred. They needed to witness with their own eyes that a live and preferably male baby wasn't cunningly swapped for one that had tragically died, or, heaven forbid, that a healthy baby girl wasn't sneakily switched out for the much-desired, dynasty-securing boy. Picture, if you will, Queen Marie-Thérèse, wife of Louis XIV, in the year 1661. The moment her royal contractions began, her previously quiet, secluded palace rooms started to fill up with a tide of nobility, all eager to witness your glorious, slimy, and hopefully male arrival. Outside the palace, a carnival-like atmosphere might take over, with performers and musicians trying to distract the Queen, or perhaps just the public, from the agonizing realities unfolding within. Or, fast forward a century and spare a thought for the unfortunate Marie Antoinette in 1778, whose first birth was a huge event. Despite her mother having stopped public births in Austria, the old traditions of Versailles held strong. When her labor began, the palace descended into chaos. Eager onlookers, as one historian calls them, hurried towards her apartments. While most were kept to outer rooms, the chaos was such that several managed to get inside, with some resourceful viewers even, quote, discovered climbed up high in order to get a really good view. The sheer press of people, the stifling heat, and the lack of fresh air in the sealed rooms were so overwhelming that after 12 agonizing hours, Marie Antoinette delivered her daughter, and promptly had a seizure, and fainted. It apparently took a few minutes before anyone in the excited crowd even noticed the Queen was unconscious. So, privacy? A foreign concept, my friend, and one you wouldn't be enjoying anytime soon. This very public debut, this immediate immersion in the gaze of the court, sets the stage for your entire life. You are, from your first breath, public property. The requirement for these high-status witnesses at a royal birth effectively turned the birthing chamber from a medical or personal space into a highly charged political stage. The presence of these nobles wasn't just about verifying the baby's legitimacy and sex, it was a crucial moment of being close to a key dynastic event. It was a chance for them to see and be seen, to show their loyalty, to guess at the immediate future of the succession, and perhaps to subtly begin lining up with the new power dynamics that your arrival would create. The birth chamber itself became an early stage for political posturing. Who got the coveted invitation to be present? Who managed to get the best spot? Whose expressions of relief, or perhaps thinly veiled disappointment, if you turned out to be another princess when a prince was desperately needed, were most visible, and most noted by others? These subtle, almost theatrical moments would be meticulously observed, remembered, and would ripple through the court, influencing groups, forging new alliances, and perhaps sowing the seeds of future plotting, all before you, the brand new, blissfully unaware prince, had even managed your first royal burp. Your life was a political play, and the curtain had just gone up on Act 1, Scene 1. So you've arrived, you're breathing, and you've been thoroughly inspected by a room full of nobles. Now, don't go expecting your mother, the Queen, to be the one feeding you every day. That's not really her department, at least not for long. Her main job was to recover from the ordeal of your birth as quickly as possible, and get right back to the crucial, dynastic task of producing more potential heirs. You see, exclusive breastfeeding can act as a natural form of birth control, stopping ovulation in some women. In a world where infant death was common, and a secure line of succession was everything, any delay in the queen's reproductive cycle was a risk the dynasty simply couldn't afford. She needed to be ready to conceive again, and soon, therefore, enter the wet nurse. And she wasn't just any local woman who happened to be lactating. Oh no. For a royal princeling like yourself, the wet nurse would be a very carefully chosen, and often very influential person. She might even come from a noble or at least a wealthy family herself. The rules for choosing her were strict. Excellent health was essential, of course. A good, pleasing appearance was often wanted. And, depending on the time and place, things like purity of bloodline could be a major factor. For instance, in 16th century Spain, a royal wet nurse had to provide a certificate proving she had no Moorish or Jewish ancestry. She was, in essence, a highly paid, incredibly valued, walking, talking, human milk carton, but one with a perfect family history and a certificate of good character from the local priest. This practice of using a wet nurse often meant that you, the tiny precious heir, were promptly shipped off to a quiet country estate, along with your wet nurse and her attendants. This was supposedly for your health. The cleaner air of the countryside was considered far better than the smells and potential infections of a crowded medieval town or city, even one with a royal palace. But a major result of this arrangement was a long separation from your actual parents, potentially for months or even years at a time. Your primary bond, the most consistent source of comfort, food, and early care in your infant life, could therefore easily become the one you formed with your wet nurse, not your biological mother, who was likely busy with court duties, her own recovery, and the constant pressure to conceive the next heir. You might even find yourself sharing your wet nurse's attention and milk with her own biological children or other infants she was paid to nurse. This created a rather unusual network of milk siblings, your first, slightly confusing but very real, group of friends. While the wet nurse was vital for your physical survival and for the smooth running of the Queen's dynastic duties, her unique and intimate position in your early life created a complex and tricky situation. She was, at the end of the day, an employee of the Crown, yet she was also your most intimate and consistent caregiver during your most important early years. She was often from a different though still respectable social class than your royal parents, yet she held considerable, if unofficial, influence over your earliest experiences, your comfort, and your first views of the world. This could, down the line, lead to a curious sort of divided loyalty in your affections, or perhaps an early understanding that care and closeness could come from people outside your immediate blood family. It also subtly highlighted the class differences of the era. Another woman's maternal role, her own biological need to nurse her child, was effectively taken over and used for the greater good, or at least the perceived good, of the dynasty. Her own children might be sent away, or given less attention, so that you, the prince, could thrive. It was a system built on necessity, but it undoubtedly shaped your earliest emotional world in ways your royal parents might not have fully understood or even considered. So you've miraculously survived the gauntlet of birth, a true obstacle course of medieval medical ideas and dynastic anxiety. You've probably spent more quality time with your wet nurse's bosom than with your own mother's face, and your existence has already been more public than a modern-day reality TV star. You've been poked, prodded, paraded before critical eyes, and generally treated less like a baby, and more like a very small, very fragile but politically crucial state asset. but don't get too comfortable in that tiny, probably louse-ridden, ermine-lined cradle. Your new home, the magnificent, imposing and undoubtedly impressive castle, is about to become your personal playground. And by playground I mean a giant, drafty, stone-cold death trap, often with questionable interior decorating choices, and an even more questionable approach to basic hygiene. And it's actively, if unintentionally, trying to kill you. One loose flagstone, one unhygienic meal, and one poorly lit spiral staircase at a time. Welcome to childhood, princely style. Forget any romantic notions you might have of luxurious, warm palaces filled with soft cushions and gentle lullabies. Medieval castles, even those lived in by the highest royalty, were primarily fortresses, designed for war, not for comfort. Comfort, in fact, was often a distant, almost irrelevant afterthought. Heating these vast stone giants was a complete nightmare. Those thick, imposing walls, so excellent at keeping out invading armies, were equally good at trapping the cold and damp within. In the earlier medieval period, when some castles were still built mainly of wood, the inhabitants, in a desperate attempt for warmth, sometimes built their living rooms directly above the animal pens, hoping to benefit from the heat generated by the pigs and cows below, a sort of primitive, and undoubtedly smelly, underfloor heating. Later, in stone castles you'd have massive fireplaces, yes, roaring with logs that could have been entire trees. But good luck trying to keep the whole sprawling castle complex even remotely warm. Firewood itself was a precious resource, often expensive, and in some cases, gathering it from the wrong patch of forest could be illegal, potentially even a crime punishable by death. Sorry, Your Highness, no fire tonight. The royal wood-gathering permit has expired. The rooms you'd live in as a young prince would likely be in a constant state of twilight. Before glass window panes became a common feature, and even when they did, they were an expensive luxury. Windows were often covered with less than ideal materials like wooden panels, shutters, or even stretched animal skin. These did a passable job of keeping out the worst of the wind and rain, but they also plunged the interiors into a perpetual gloom. Later, when leaded window panes with small, round pieces of glass did appear, they let in a bit more light, but hardly flooded the rooms with sunshine. You'd be squinting a lot. And the dampness. Oh, the dampness was a constant, unwelcome companion. The very stones of the castle seemed to weep, holding a cool, clammy dampness, even in the height of summer. To fight this, walls might be lined with rather rustic insulation, such as wild boar skins, and then covered with wooden paneling. Later, elaborate tapestries came into fashion, not just for their beauty, depicting heroic battles or Bible stories, but also for their practical ability to insulate against the cold, and block some of the drafts that whistled through every nook and cranny. But it was, in many ways, a losing battle against the creeping chill. As for your princely furniture, don't expect a lot of plush sofas and comfy chairs. Furnishings in medieval castles were generally minimal, even for the wealthy. The chest was the workhorse of medieval furniture, a versatile piece used not only for storing clothes and valuables, but also often serving as a makeshift chair or even a table. Proper wardrobes only became common towards the end of the Middle Ages, when the sheer amount of noble clothing presumably outgrew the capacity of the average chest. You, as a prince, would likely sleep in a grand four-poster bed. This was a large bed, heavily curtained all around, and often raised on steps. The curtains provided a bit of privacy, and, more importantly, trapped some warmth, creating a little bubble of warmth for sleeping. The raised steps were also a practical idea. Hot air rises, so being a few feet off the cold stone floor was a small but significant mercy. while the lord, his family and any important guests would enjoy the relative luxury of heavy blankets, feather mattresses, a big step up from straw, and perhaps fur covers. People of lower status, including many of your attendants, would have to make do with lighter bedclothes and the body heat of too many people crammed into a small space. The castle, then, was less a nurturing home for a young child, and more a constant, unavoidable reminder of your high, yet dangerous, status. Its very design, the high walls, the fortified towers, the arrow slits, spoke of defense, of threat, of a world where power was maintained through stone and steel. For a young prince, growing up within these imposing, comfortless walls would be an early and stark introduction to a world defined by hardship, watchfulness, and the ever-present possibility of attack. It would shape your understanding of home, not as a place of warmth and safety, but as a fortress, a symbol of your family's power, and a place that demanded your eventual defense. Personal comfort was secondary to the needs of the dynasty. Now let's talk about the delicate subject of sanitation, or rather, the often spectacular lack thereof. Medieval plumbing, even in the grandest of castles, was an art form that leaned heavily towards the foulest end of the spectrum. Your royal toilet, often referred to nicely as a garderobe or a privy, was typically a rather simple affair. Imagine a simple hole, perhaps cut into a wooden or stone bench, leading down a chute. And where did this chute lead? Well, if you were lucky, into a specially built cesspit at the foot of the castle walls. If you were less lucky, or if the castle design was particularly, shall we say, efficient, it might empty directly into the moat. Yes, that picturesque body of water surrounding your noble home, often doubled as a giant, open-air sewer. Think about that the next time you see a romantic painting of a castle with swans gliding gracefully on the moat. They were probably gliding on something far less graceful. The resulting smell, especially during a warm summer, must have been memorable. And these garderobes weren't just an assault on the nose. They were a genuine security risk. Particularly bold, and presumably nose-blind, attackers sometimes attempted to get into a castle by climbing up these waste chutes. Imagine the indignity of being surprised by an enemy emerging from your toilet. A truly undignified way to start a siege. Running water, the kind that magically appears when you turn a tap, was a distant dream. Water was a precious and labor-intensive resource. Castles relied heavily on wells, which were often dug within the castle walls for security during a siege. Some of these wells were engineering marvels, incredibly deep. The one at Beeston Castle, for instance, plunged down 124 meters. A few more advanced castles might have had basic systems of lead, wooden or ceramic pipes to carry water from a spring or a tank, which collected rainwater, to various parts of the complex, such as the kitchens or the keep. But the idea of a daily hot soaking bath, forget it. That was a luxury few could afford, mainly because of the enormous amount of fuel required to heat the vast quantities of water needed to fill a large wooden tub. So rare was this luxury that even monks, known for their discipline, were typically forbidden from taking more than 2 or 3 full baths in an entire year. So, how did a young prince keep clean? For daily washing, you, like most people, would have made do with a basin of water, probably cold, unless a servant had gone to the trouble of heating a small amount over a fire. Hands were, by necessity and politeness, washed before and after meals, especially since cutlery was rare for many, and even nobles often ate with their fingers. Soap, made from animal fats and ash, was sometimes used, and teeth might be given a basic cleaning with frayed twigs, hazel was popular, or small pieces of wool cloth. Even if your castle was a model of cleanliness by medieval standards, which is a very low bar, the general environment outside its walls, especially if it was near a town, was likely to be unhygienic. Streets in medieval towns often functioned as open sewers, with household waste, animal droppings, and all sorts of mystery liquids, creating a charmingly fragrant swamp. While a castle might be slightly elevated from this, the overall smell of medieval life was hard to escape. This widespread lack of sanitation, from the primitive waste disposal of the castle itself, to the limited bathing dictated by the scarcity of clean, heated water, created an environment that was a playground for germs. While the direct link between germs and disease wasn't understood until centuries later, the consequences of these unhygienic conditions were all too clear. The castle, far from being a sanctuary protected by its mighty walls, was often a potential breeding ground for a host of nasty illnesses. You, as a young prince, despite your royal status, were highly susceptible to waterborne and foodborne diseases like dysentery and typhoid, as well as a host of other infections that thrived in close, unclean spaces. Your luxurious surroundings, therefore, were directly linked to a significantly high risk of falling gravely ill, or worse. The invisible threat of disease was a constant, unwelcome guest in your royal nursery. Now, if the general dampness and dubious plumbing weren't enough to deal with, let's consider the everyday physical dangers of your palace prison. Medieval castles, you see, were not designed with the delicate feelings, or indeed the basic safety, of a small child in mind. They were, in essence, giant, stone-built obstacle courses, filled with an array of features perfectly designed to maim or kill anyone not paying attention, especially if that person was, say, a curious toddler prince with a love for exploring. Steep, winding spiral staircases, often uneven and poorly lit. Check. Battlements and ramparts offering spectacular views and equally spectacular drops, usually without the comforting presence of a safety railing. Double check. Open wells, essential for water but also a gaping hole for an unsupervised child. Absolutely. Armories, conveniently located within the castle walls, stocked with an exciting assortment of swords, axes, maces, and other pointy, heavy objects just begging to be played with, naturally. And let's not forget charming architectural features like murder holes, those delightful openings in ceilings through which defenders could drop boiling oil or rocks on invaders, but which could also, presumably, swallow a small, adventurous prince if he wasn't careful. Think of yourself as a little royal explorer. The Great Hall, the bustling heart of the castle, might even have had an early, basic listening device, a laird's lug as it was known in Scotland, allowing the lord to eavesdrop on conversations from the privacy of his bedroom above. Fascinating for spying, not so great if you were hoping for a moment of unobserved childhood mischief. Dungeons and oubliettes. Those particularly charming, inescapable underground pits designed to drive prisoners insane, were also key parts of the castle structure. One would hope you wouldn't just wander in there looking for a quiet place to play with your carved wooden knight, but accidents happen. Adding to the general chaos and potential for mishap, castles were often home to a collection of animals. Hunting dogs, essential for the noble pastime, would have been a common sight. Livestock, such as horses for the knights, and perhaps even some animals destined for the kitchen, might also be stabled within or very near the main living quarters, especially in earlier castles or during sieges. This brought with it not just the potential for accidental kicks or bites, but also an additional layer of delightful medieval smells, and, of course, more opportunities for the spread of disease. The design of castles focused almost entirely on military defense and the functional needs of adult life. There is absolutely no evidence of childproofing in the modern sense. No safety gates at the top of those treacherous stone stairs, no padded corners on the oaken chests, no locks on the armory door to keep curious little hands away from razor-sharp poleaxes. This implies that children, including a young prince like yourself, were either expected to somehow magically develop an adult sense of self-preservation from a very early age, or they were under constant, hawk-eyed supervision. Given the number of attendants a prince would have, the latter is more likely, but even the most watchful nursemaid can't prevent every tumble or ill-advised exploration. This early and constant exposure to a physically dangerous environment would undoubtedly contribute to a worldview where danger was simply an accepted, ever-present part of life. Personal safety wasn't an inherent right, it was a matter of constant watchfulness, luck, or complete reliance on the attentiveness of others. It also strongly underscores the idea that children were largely integrated into adult spaces and adult dangers, without much special treatment for their natural vulnerabilities. Your nursery was, in many ways, a battlefield in miniature. Alright, so let's say you've somehow managed to navigate the treacherous terrain of your castle home without breaking your neck, and you've avoided falling victim to the various fragrant diseases lurking in the moat. What happens when you inevitably get the medieval equivalent of the sniffles, or worse, a raging fever, or a nasty infection from a scraped knee, which in this environment was a distinct possibility? Well, then you get to experience the terrifying delights of medieval medicine, where the cures were often considerably more alarming than the disease itself. As a child, you were a magnet for all sorts of ailments. Dysentery, malaria, diphtheria, influenza, typhoid, smallpox, and even leprosy were all making the rounds. And remember, the odds weren't great. It's been grimly noted that perhaps only 1 out of every 10 adults in the general population lived to see the age of 50. Your royal blood didn't grant you immunity. Medieval medical theory was largely dominated by the ancient Greek physician Galen's theory of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Your body was seen as a delicate system of these fluids, and any illness was believed to be caused by an imbalance among them. Got a fever? Clearly you had an excess of blood. The obvious solution? Bloodletting. This charming procedure involved a physician, or more often a barber surgeon. Yes, the same fellow who cut your father's hair and beard. Making a cut, often with a less than sterile blade, or applying a few hungry leeches to strategic points on your body to drain off the extra vital fluid. Imagine being a small child, already feeling wretched, and then having someone approach you with a sharp object and a bowl, intending to make you bleed. Comforting. Feeling a bit down in the dumps, perhaps a touch melancholic or anxious. That would be an excess of black bile, my princely friend. The cure for that, according to the wisdom of the age, was a good purge, perhaps some potent laxatives made from herbs that would have you regretting every turnip you ever ate, or a warm herbal purge that sounded deceptively soothing but probably wasn't. And then there was trepanation. If you suffered from severe headaches, epilepsy, or what was considered mental illness, which could be anything from real psychosis to just being a particularly moody teenager, the physicians might decide that evil spirits were trapped inside your skull. The solution? Drill a hole in your head to let them out. And the best part? You'd be wide awake for this delicate head surgery, probably held down, listening to the scrape and grind of the tool. No anesthetic, just pure, unadulterated terror. If that wasn't enough to haunt your princely nightmares, consider medicinal cannibalism. Yes, you heard that right. It was a widely accepted belief in medieval times that consuming parts of the human body could cure various ailments. Doctors might prescribe a refreshing drink of human blood for conditions like epilepsy or migraines. The wealthy, including kings and queens, sometimes consumed potions made from powdered Egyptian mummies or other human remains, believing it would grant vitality or cure illness. One shudders to think what might have been slipped into your royal porridge. There were some slightly less terrifying, though still peculiar, treatments. The king's touch, for instance, was a belief that the monarch, by divine right, could heal certain diseases, particularly scrofula, a form of tuberculosis affecting the neck, also known as the king's evil, simply by touching the sick person. It's a bit ironic if you, the prince, were the one who was sick, and your father, the king, was expected to cure you with a tap on the head. However, it wasn't all doom and leeches. Wound repair, particularly for injuries from battle or training, could be surprisingly advanced for the era. Surgeons understood the importance of cleaning wounds, even if they didn't fully grasp germ theory. They used maggots to clean wounds by eating dead tissue, which actually helped prevent infection, and used honey, now known for its antibacterial properties, as a wound dressing. In a famous case, Prince Henry, later King Henry V, survived a potentially fatal arrow wound to the face, thanks to the skilled work of his surgeon John Bradmore, who meticulously removed the arrowhead using specially designed tools coated in rose honey, and then oversaw a lengthy healing process involving more applications of honey. So if you were lucky enough to get an arrow in the face instead of a common cold, your chances of a somewhat rational treatment might actually have been higher. Beyond the sheer uselessness or, in many cases, the active harm caused by these medieval cures, the psychological impact of undergoing such treatments would have been huge, especially for a child. The almost complete lack of anesthesia for painful procedures, the invasive and often terrifying nature of treatments like bloodletting and trepanation, and the sheer bizarre and gruesome remedies like medicinal cannibalism, would have created an intense atmosphere of fear and anxiety around any illness. For a young prince, falling sick wouldn't just mean physical suffering, it would mean the terrifying prospect of being subjected to painful, impossible to understand, and potentially life-threatening procedures by people in authority. This could easily lead to a lifelong fear of sickness and physicians, a deep-seated distrust of healing, and a pervasive sense of bodily vulnerability, in a world where even supposed help could be a horrific ordeal in itself. Your royal nursery would feel less like a sickbay, and more like a torture chamber waiting to happen. Right. So, assuming you haven't been unceremoniously carried off by the plague, or accidentally impaled yourself on a conveniently misplaced decorative spear in the castle courtyard, or had your vital humors balanced into an early grave by a well-meaning but utterly misguided royal physician, who smells faintly of leeches and deep despair, it's time for the next exciting chapter in your young life, your education. And trust me, this isn't going to be a gentle introduction to finger painting and nap time, with sing-alongs about fluffy sheep. This is medieval prince school, where the main subjects are pain, politics, and the surprisingly complex art of how to look vaguely regal in a suit of armor that probably weighs more than you do, and smells faintly of old sweat and existential dread. Get your quill ready, young sire, because class is in session, and the curriculum is a killer. Your formal education, or what passed for it in an era that valued a strong sword arm as much as, if not more than, a sharp mind, would begin relatively young. Often by the tender age of 7 or 8, you'd be handed over to tutors and governors, sometimes in a completely separate household, set up just for you, and perhaps a few carefully chosen noble companions. Think of Edward IV's sons, for example, who were packed off to Ludlow Castle to be brought up under the watchful eye of a governor. This wasn't necessarily a sign of parental neglect. Rather, it was often seen as a way to provide a focused, controlled environment for your princely upbringing, away from the distractions and potential bad influences of the main court, or sometimes for health reasons, to escape the disease-filled air of medieval cities. Your daily life would be anything but relaxed. Take the example of young Prince Edward, son of King Edward IV, whose day was meticulously, almost brutally scheduled. Your day would likely start at a convenient hour, which probably meant before the sun has any bright ideas. First up, matins. That's morning prayers, recited in your chamber by your personal chaplains. Then, it was off to Mass, usually in your private chapel or a designated closet, and woe to anyone who dared to interrupt this sacred ritual. On holy days you'd be expected to make offerings, and on feast days you'd get to enjoy a sermon, which was probably thrilling. After all that spiritual nourishment, it was time for breakfast, immediately followed by a session of virtuous learning, carefully tailored to be appropriate for your princely age and future responsibilities. By 10 o'clock in the morning, it was already time for dinner. Yes, dinner at 10 a.m. This wasn't a light snack. Meat would be served, presented by worshipful folks and squires wearing livery. And you certainly wouldn't be eating alone, though only those deemed suitable by your governor would be allowed to share your table. And what delightful entertainment accompanied this midday meal? Not jesters or minstrels usually, but the reading aloud of noble stories. These tales were carefully selected to encourage virtue, honor, knowledge, wisdom, and all manner of good deeds. Crucially, instructions often specified that there should be nothing in these stories that might move or stir him to vice. So, probably not a lot of Chaucer's more naughty tales. On fast days this dinner would be shifted to noon. The afternoon brought more learning, instruction in grammar, music, and the humanities. And then, finally, some physical activity, which we'll delve into more shortly. As evening approached, you'd attend vespers, evening prayers, followed by supper around 4 o'clock. After supper, a brief period of recreation was permitted, with sports as shall be conveniently devised for his recreation, which probably meant something suitably educational and not too rowdy. Then, it was off to bed. Until the age of 12, Prince Edward was tucked in by 8 o'clock. Later, he was allowed the wild luxury of staying up until 9. Even then, servants and tutors were encouraged to enforce themselves to make him merry and joyous towards his bed. Once you were in your chamber, with the bed curtains drawn, everyone was excluded except for your designated night attendant, who was tasked with watching over you throughout the night, just in case of sudden illness, with a physician and surgeon always on call. This kind of highly structured, duty-focused daily routine wasn't just about keeping you busy. It was a form of brainwashing. The relentless schedule, the constant emphasis on religious observance, the carefully curated virtuous learning, and the reading of noble stories were all designed not merely to teach you things, but to meticulously mold you, the young prince, into the ideal ruler as defined by the values and fears of the era. It was about instilling strict discipline, deep religious belief, and a solid sense of duty from the earliest possible age. Every hour was accounted for, every activity had a purpose, all geared towards shaping you for the crown. There was very little room for a spontaneous childhood, for personal choice, or for the kind of unstructured play that allows a child to simply be a child. Your life was a script, and you were expected to learn your lines perfectly. Now, what exactly was on this princely curriculum, besides an overdose of piety and stories of virtuous knights who probably never had to deal with a leaky toilet? Well, as a medieval noble, and particularly as a prince destined for the throne, you had to become a true jack-of-all-trades, mastering a dauntingly wide range of subjects. On the academic front, languages were key. Latin was the common language of the learned world, the language of the church, of diplomacy, and of scholarship across Europe. If you wanted to read important texts, communicate with foreign diplomats, or understand what the Pope was on about, Latin was non-negotiable. For English kings and princes, French was also vitally important, a legacy of the Norman conquest, and the ongoing political and cultural ties, and rivalries, with France. Indeed, many monarchs and high nobles spoke multiple languages, as effective rule and diplomacy often demanded it. Beyond languages, your tutors would drill you in grammar, the arts, which often included public speaking and logic, some basic sciences, often mixed with philosophy and religion, geometry, astronomy, crucial for understanding calendars, navigation, and perhaps a bit of astrology for good measure, and music. The humanities and literature were also key components. The aim was to provide virtuous guidance, to make you not just a knowledgeable ruler, but a wise and moral one. Then there were the practical and political subjects, the nuts and bolts of actually running a kingdom. You'd need to learn essential management skills to oversee the vast estates, the armies of servants, and the crowds of peasant laborers that formed the economic backbone of your future realm. A deep knowledge of military tactics was absolutely crucial. This wasn't just about playing with toy soldiers. It involved understanding the brutal realities of siege warfare, how to attack a fortified position and how to defend your own, as well as the complexities of troop deployment, supply lines, and battlefield logistics. You would also be expected to develop an understanding of law and the business of running a kingdom, perhaps by observing or even participating in council meetings from a young age, learning how decisions were made, how disputes were settled, and how the intricate machinery of state operated. This incredibly broad and demanding curriculum, covering intellectual pursuits, the practicalities of statecraft, and the harsh necessities of martial skill, was designed to forge a leader capable of navigating an exceedingly complex and often treacherous world, both on the battlefield. It was about creating a kind of medieval Renaissance man in training, long before the term was coined. The sheer breadth of knowledge and skills you were expected to master highlights the immense pressure placed upon your young mind. You weren't just learning, you were being meticulously prepared, piece by piece, to bear the weight of a crown. There was no room for slacking, no option to focus on just one area. You had to be good at everything, because the survival of your dynasty, and perhaps your own life, depended on it. And speaking of survival, let's move on to the more vigorous part of your education, physical training, medieval style. This wasn't about a friendly game of tag in the courtyard. This was serious, often brutal, preparation for a life that could at any moment demand extreme physical prowess. As a medieval noble, and especially as a prince who might one day lead armies, mastering horsemanship, a variety of weapons, and the effective use of armor was not optional. It was essential. Your afternoons would be dedicated to precisely these things: horsemanship, swordsmanship, and the rather exciting-sounding sport of tilting at the quintain, which was essentially a practice target for jousting, often a shield on a swiveling pole that would swing around and whack you if you weren't quick enough to dodge it after your strike. Add to that other princely sports, designed to hone your combat skills and build your stamina. Knights, the elite warriors of the age, typically began their training in childhood and continued for up to a decade, practicing nimble footwork, learning how to block incoming attacks, and mastering various gruesome but effective ways to dispatch their opponents as quickly as possible. Sword fighting was far from random hacking and slashing. It was a sophisticated martial art, a deadly dance with its own complex techniques, stances, and even named moves like the Wrath-Hew, the Crumpler, or the Sculler. This deadly craft was often taught by renowned fight masters, elite athletes, and warriors themselves. These masters might be hired by nobles to train them and their household guards, or they might even set up their own fight schools, passing on their lethal knowledge to aspiring warriors. Your training wouldn't have been a gentle introduction. While practice with real sharpened weapons would have been saved for later stages or actual combat due to the obvious danger and the damage it would do to the blades, you would have started with wooden or blunted metal weapons. However, don't imagine these were harmless toys. A solid blow from a blunted practice sword or a heavy wooden practice sword could still cause significant injury. Bruises, broken bones, or concussions were all part of the learning curve. And then there was the armor. A typical suit of field armor in the 15th century, the kind you'd be expected to wear and fight in, could weigh anywhere between 30 and 50 kilograms. That's roughly 66 to 110 pounds. Now imagine strapping that much articulated steel onto your body, especially if you were a youth, still growing and developing. Just moving around in it was a workout. Studies have shown that movement in such armor was about twice as energy draining as moving unloaded. It significantly impaired breathing, and required immense muscular strength simply to walk, let alone run, jump, or swing a weapon effectively. Your physical education was, in many ways, an education in enduring extreme physical discomfort and effort. This intense, often brutal physical and martial training served multiple critical purposes in your development as a prince. Firstly, it was an absolutely necessary skill set for a future military leader, in an age where kings were often expected to lead their armies in person. Secondly, it was a public display of noble skill, a way to demonstrate your strength, courage, and fitness to rule. And thirdly, it was a harsh rite of passage, a way of getting you used to, from a very young age, pain, extreme effort, and the tools and mindset of violence. It was, in essence, survival training for a violent world, designed to forge you into a hardened individual, capable of both enduring and inflicting violence when necessary. This process might have made you tough, but it could also have come at the cost of empathy, or a gentler nature, normalizing physical suffering as a part of life. Now, if swinging heavy swords and wrestling in armor wasn't thrilling enough, there was always jousting. Jousting, the ultimate medieval spectator sport, a dazzling display of chivalry, skill, and an almost suicidal disregard for personal safety. For a young prince, participating in tournaments, and particularly in the joust, was practically mandatory. It was the ultimate test of a knight's skill, strength, and courage, the medieval equivalent of the Olympics and the Super Bowl rolled into one, with a much higher chance of impalement. It evolved from actual military cavalry tactics into a highly specialized, if still incredibly dangerous, sport by the late Middle Ages. Princes and kings absolutely loved jousting. It was a prime opportunity to showcase their courage, their horsemanship, and their martial talents, before an adoring, and often politically influential, crowd. Your training for this would involve endless hours practicing with the quintain, that swiveling target designed to teach you accuracy and the crucial skill of ducking the counterswing. You'd be kitted out in specialized jousting armor, often heavier and more reinforced than field armor, particularly on the left side where the lance impact was expected. The iconic frogmouth helmet, designed to deflect lances, was a common feature, but make no mistake, this was no gentle pastime. The dangers were immense, and often fatal. Imagine two heavily armored knights, each weighing a considerable amount with their gear, mounted on powerful warhorses, charging at each other at combined speeds that could reach 50 to 60 miles per hour. The impact was huge. Being unhorsed was common, and could easily lead to broken limbs, a strained or broken back from the awkward fall in heavy armor, or severe concussions. Piercing wounds from a shattered lance, despite the use of coronels, blunted or three-pronged tips designed to break on impact rather than penetrate, were a constant risk. History is littered with examples of jousting royalty, who paid a heavy price for their passion. King Henry VIII of England, an avid jouster, was badly injured on at least 2 occasions. In 1524, he suffered a blow above his right eye, when he failed to properly close his visor. More seriously, In 1536 he was unhorsed, and his armored horse then fell on top of him, leaving him unconscious for 2 hours. Some historians speculate that this accident may have caused brain damage, contributing to his notorious ill temper and paranoia in later life. Across the Channel, King Henri II of France wasn't so lucky. He died in 1559 when a splinter from a shattered lance pierced his eye through the visor and penetrated his brain. Earlier, Gilbert Marshall, son of the famous William Marshall, died in a tournament in 1241, after being thrown from his horse and dragged, his foot caught in the stirrup. Even when lances were supposed to be blunted, accidents happened. Sharp lances were sometimes used by mistake, or even intentionally in certain types of jousts known as jousts to the death. Jousting, therefore, was far more than just a sport for a medieval prince. It was a high-stakes, high-risk, and highly visible public performance of the warrior virtues that were expected of him. The immense danger, even for the highest-ranking royalty, mirrored the constant risks of his powerful but shaky position. A victory in the joust brought glory, praise, and reinforced his image as a capable future leader. But a mistake, a moment of bad luck, or a particularly skilled opponent could mean severe injury, lifelong disability, or even a spectacular and very public death, all before an audience of his peers, his subjects, and potentially his political rivals. It was a very literal and very dangerous way of performing his fitness to rule. A small-scale version of the perilous Game of Thrones he was born into. So with all this talk of brutal training, heavy armor, and sports that might as well have been called competitive impalement, what happened when you, our young prince, inevitably got injured? And what was the physical toll over time of this rather aggressive educational program? Combat training, even when conducted with supposedly safe blunted weapons, was inherently dangerous, and accidents were frequent. A misplaced blow, a fall, or an over-enthusiastic sparring partner could easily result in sprains, fractures, or worse. Head and facial trauma were particularly serious, not just for the physical injury itself, but because ugly scars could carry a significant social stigma, potentially impacting your princely image and authority. Then there was the armor itself. As we've discussed, a full suit of plate armor, weighing between 30 and 50 kilograms, was a colossal burden, especially for a growing youth. Constantly training and moving in this steel shell significantly increased the energy cost of every action, restricted breathing, and placed enormous strain on your joints and muscles. Over years of such training, this would undoubtedly lead to chronic aches, pains, and potentially long-term muscle and bone problems. When injuries did occur, the medical aftermath could be almost as traumatic as the injury itself. First aid for common training injuries like cuts and bruises was basic. Wounds might be washed with whatever was handy: water, which might not be clean, beer, or vinegar. Honey, with its natural antibiotic properties, though they wouldn't have understood the science behind it, was a common and surprisingly effective application for cuts. Poultices made from local herbs were also widely used. For more serious injuries like broken bones, you'd be in the hands of a bone setter. This was often a specialized skill, passed down through generations, though sometimes a barber surgeon might attempt it. The bone setter would carefully feel the injured area to assess the damage, then manually pull and manipulate the limb to realign the broken bones, a procedure that would have been incredibly painful without anesthesia. Once set, the limb would be wrapped tightly in flannel strips, and sometimes packed in comfrey paste, which dried to form a hard cast, or encased in dried mud. If the bones weren't set correctly, or if infection set in, a very common complication, it could lead to permanent disability, chronic pain, or even death. Severe wounds from weapons, even practice ones, required more drastic measures. They would be cleaned as best as possible, perhaps packed with herbs, and sometimes sewn shut with ordinary needle and thread, before the advent of surgical string. Cauterization, searing the wound with a red-hot iron, was sometimes used to stop bleeding, especially after an amputation, another charming possibility in your martial education. While some medieval surgeons were surprisingly skilled for their time, as shown in the case of Prince Henry, later Henry V, such expertise was not universally available, and even the best surgeons worked without a true understanding of infection or sterilization. The combination of this dangerous, physically demanding training, the immense burden of wearing and fighting in heavy armor, and the often basic or downright terrifying medical care available for the inevitable injuries, suggests that a medieval prince would likely live with a significant degree of chronic pain, persistent discomfort. This wasn't just an occasional bump or scrape, it was a constant backdrop to your existence. Physical hardship and pain were likely normalized, accepted as part of the package of being a noble warrior. This might have bred a high pain tolerance and a stoic personality, but it also meant that long-term physical ailments, arthritis, old fractures that never quite healed right, these would be your unwelcome companions, potentially affecting your well-being and your ability to rule effectively later in life. You were being forged in a crucible of pain. Amidst all this physical hardship, political maneuvering, and the constant threat of an early demise, what about emotional support? A loving hug from mother, a comforting word from father. Well, let's just say that the emotional world of a medieval prince's childhood was often as chilly and drafty as his castle bedroom. While it's now generally accepted by historians that medieval parents did indeed love their children, the practicalities of a royal upbringing often created significant emotional distance. As we've touched upon, princes were frequently separated from their parents from a young age. Many were sent to live in separate households, often in different castles or estates, under the care of governors, tutors, and a host of attendants. This was done for various reasons. Sometimes to provide a more focused educational environment, sometimes for health reasons, and sometimes to begin fostering political alliances, or to govern faraway territories in the prince's name, even as a child. Furthermore, the practice of wet nursing, as discussed earlier, meant that the prince's primary caregiver in infancy was often not his mother. Royal parents, like the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, might entrust the daily care and upbringing of their children to others, focusing their own energies on the children's formal education from afar, and, more crucially, on wielding political power and providing support for their dynastic futures once they were older, rather than on day-to-day emotional involvement and nurturing. The Queen, your mother, was often under immense pressure to produce more heirs, a cycle of pregnancy, birth, and recovery that left little time or energy for intensive mothering of existing children, especially once they were past infancy. Your father, the king, would be consumed by the monumental tasks of ruling a kingdom, waging wars, managing nobles, dispensing justice, and navigating the tricky currents of international diplomacy. The rigorously structured daily schedule of a prince left very little room for unstructured family time, for spontaneous affection, or for the kind of casual, everyday interactions that build close emotional bonds. While a king's detailed instructions for his son's upbringing certainly show a deep and tender care in the planning and provision for his well-being, the actual day-to-day emotional connection would likely have been with his tutors, his chaplains, and his personal attendants, rather than with his often absent royal parents. This environment, characterized by early and often long physical separation from parents, primary care by a host of other figures, and a highly structured, duty-focused upbringing, would likely foster a strong sense of emotional self-reliance, and perhaps a degree of emotional coldness. It wasn't necessarily an unloving environment. Concern and affection were certainly present, but the kind of reliable, comforting presence from parents that helps a child feel safe was unlikely to be a feature of your princely childhood. You would learn, by necessity, to be emotionally resilient, perhaps even stoic, to keep your own thoughts to yourself, and to navigate your complex world without relying heavily on parental emotional support. Affection might be demonstrated through providing for your education and future, but the warm, fuzzy, consistently available emotional safety net? Probably not so much. This emotional self-sufficiency, while a potential survival tactic in the harsh world of medieval court politics, could also lead to difficulties in forming close, trusting relationships later in life. So you've been systematically bashed, bruised, and quite possibly bored to tears by endless Latin verbs and lectures on the finer points of heraldry. Your armor, if you've been diligent in your training, probably carries the distinct, lingering smell of a wet dog that's been rolling in old cheese, and you've likely developed the emotional availability of a particularly stoic root vegetable. Congratulations, young prince. You're almost ready for the main event, the glittering, treacherous stage upon which your future will be decided, courtly life. Think of it as a slightly more perfumed, silk-draped battlefield, where the preferred weapons are not swords and lances, but rather honeyed whispers, strategically deployed smiles that hide daggers of intent, and the silent, crushing weight of constant observation. In this world, everyone, absolutely everyone, is watching you. Especially, it often seemed, when you were trying to have a moment of peace on the royal toilet. Get ready to navigate a world where your every breath is a political statement. One of the first and most jarring realities you'd have to accept as a medieval prince is that privacy, as we understand it today, was a complete myth, a concept as alien as a smartphone or a decent dental plan. Medieval life, particularly for those at the top of the social pyramid like royalty, was an intensely public affair. The idea of being truly alone, of having personal space free from the prying eyes and attentive ears of others, simply didn't exist. In fact, actively seeking out privacy was often viewed with suspicion. What evil deeds or unseemly thoughts could one possibly be hiding that required solitude? Your most intimate moments were rarely, if ever, your own. It was common practice for servants, pages, or ladies-in-waiting to sleep at the foot of the beds of their lords and ladies, even while they were being intimate. These attendants were privy to the most secret conversations, the most private arguments, the most vulnerable moments, simply because they were always there, an almost invisible, yet ever-present, part of the household. A king or a prince was never truly alone. If a king wasn't spending the night with his queen or a favored mistress, it wasn't unheard of for him to invite a particularly respected courtier, or an important guest, to share his royal bed, supposedly for warmth and companionship. This wasn't seen as odd, rather it was considered a great public honor, a clear mark of royal favor. This startling lack of personal space extended to even the most basic bodily functions. The infamous groom of the stool is a prime example of this. This was not some lowly servant, but often a high-ranking nobleman, a trusted friend, and confidant of the king. His rather unique and somewhat unenviable duty was to attend the king during his most private moments on the close stool, essentially a chamber pot enclosed in a padded, often velvet-covered chair. While the task itself might seem undignified to us, the position of groom of the stool was highly desired. Why? Because it gave unparalleled private access to the monarch, a chance to speak with him informally, to influence his thoughts, and to gain his ear away from the noise and competition of the open court. The very existence of such a role shows the extreme lengths to which attendance was taken, and the near-total lack of what we would consider personal privacy. This public nature of royal life began, as we've seen, at the very moment of your birth, with a room full of nobles scrutinizing your arrival. And it continued throughout your life. The elaborate public getting up and going to bed rituals of later monarchs like Louis XIV of France, which could involve around 100 male spectators, meticulously observing the king being dressed or undressed, are from a slightly later period. But they represent the ultimate expression of a long-standing medieval tradition where the monarch's daily routine was, in many ways, a public performance. Every action, from waking to sleeping, was filled with political meaning and subject to the gaze of the court. This constant lack of privacy, this existence lived under the constant, unblinking eye of the court, was more than just an inconvenience or a social custom. It functioned as a subtle but powerful mechanism of social and political control, and it must have been a deep and unrelenting source of psychological stress for any prince. Imagine never being able to relax fully, never being able to express a spontaneous emotion or a controversial thought without it being noted, reported, and potentially twisted by various groups within the court. Every word, every gesture, every sigh could be interpreted, analyzed, and used for or against you. This would inevitably create a highly guarded personality, a sharp, almost painful awareness of being perpetually judged, and potentially an intense, gnawing paranoia, as anyone around you. Your servants, your tutors, even your friends, could be a source of information, or misinformation, for the ever-churning rumor mill and the competing power brokers of the court. Your life was a stage, and you were always on, and what a stage it was. The royal court was not some idyllic haven of chivalry and refined manners, despite what the minstrels might sing. It was, more often than not, a true viper's nest, a seething pot of group rivalry, religious plotting, power plays, and delicate, often treacherous, international diplomacy. This was where power, prestige, and vast sums of money came together, creating an environment ripe for ambition, jealousy, and betrayal. Courts throughout history, and the medieval period was no exception, were notorious for their intricate webs of intrigue and their ruthless power politics. As a prince, especially a young one still learning the ropes, you would be thrust directly into the center of these complex and often dangerous schemes, a valuable pawn or a potential threat in the eyes of various competing groups. Royal conspiracies were a significant and recurring feature of medieval political life. The court was famously described as a place to see and be seen, a phrase that perfectly captures the constant maneuvering for favor, influence, and closeness to power that characterized courtly existence. These dynamics of competing factions, the families and individuals fighting for the monarch's ear, and for control over policy and jobs, were a long-standing and deeply ingrained medieval tradition. As a young prince, you would have to learn, and learn quickly, how to navigate these dangerous waters. You'd need to develop a keen eye for spotting true allies from those who merely smiled to your face while secretly sharpening their daggers. Figuratively, or perhaps even literally. Every conversation could be a test. Every gift could have strings attached. Every piece of advice could be tainted by a hidden agenda. This early and unavoidable immersion in the cutthroat realities of court politics would be a harsh and practical education in gaining and keeping power, an environment where being naive or trusting the wrong person could have fatal consequences. Your closest advisors, your childhood companions, even members of your own extended family, could be deeply involved in these factions, their loyalties divided, their motives complex and often hidden. You were learning to play the game of thrones before you could even properly reach the throne. And all this political maneuvering, this constant watchfulness was happening, while the immense weight of the world, and the even heavier symbolic weight of the future crown, rested squarely on your young shoulders. From your earliest conscious moments, you would be acutely aware that you were not just any child, you were a future ruler, a key dynastic figure, the container for all your kingdom's hopes and fears. The pressure to embody all the idealized virtues of kingship, wisdom, piety, justice, strength, and warrior skill, would be relentless and all-encompassing. Detailed instructions drafted by kings for their sons' upbringings reveal a profound concern, bordering on anxiety, for the prince's moral, intellectual and physical preparedness for the burdens of rule. Every aspect of the prince's life was to be geared towards this ultimate goal. The psychological pressure on heirs, particularly concerning the sacred duty of ensuring the succession and maintaining the stability of the dynasty, was enormous. The infamous obsession of Henry VIII with securing a male heir, which led him to break with the Church of Rome and marry 6 times, is perhaps the most glaring example of this dynastic anxiety, but it was a pressure felt by virtually every monarch and heir. Imagine as a young boy the crushing stress of knowing that the fate of an entire kingdom, the very continuation of your family line and the political stability of the realm could hinge entirely on your personal ability to survive to adulthood, to marry well, which usually meant strategically, not for love, and then to successfully produce your own healthy heir. This wasn't just about personal achievement or securing your own future. It was seen as a matter of national security, a reflection of God's will, and the ultimate measure of your worth as a prince. The fear of being poisoned or violently killed would be a constant, chilling undercurrent to your daily existence. Every shadow could hide an assassin. Every unfamiliar face could be a threat. This was not a childhood. It was a high-wire act performed without a net, with the entire kingdom watching. And speaking of things that could do you in, let's not forget the simple act of eating. In a medieval court, even your dinner came with a side order of potential danger. Food in medieval times, even for the nobility who had access to a wider variety of ingredients, wasn't always the pinnacle of safety or purity. The watering down or mixing of foodstuffs was a common problem, as dishonest sellers sought to stretch their valuable goods and increase their profits. Precious spices like saffron, worth more than its weight in gold, could be cunningly mixed with cheaper look-alike substances such as safflower, or bulked out with starch, or even alarmingly, with ground glass to add weight. Camphor, another expensive good, might be mixed with waste marble trimmings. Even the staple of life, bread, wasn't immune. It could be bulked up with less desirable ingredients like bean flour or rice flour, to make the more expensive wheat flour go further. The overall lack of strict food safety standards and the opportunities for tampering meant that even the royal kitchens were not entirely safe from such practices, or from simple spoilage and contamination in an era without refrigeration. More terrifying than accidental contamination, however, was the ever-present fear of deliberate poisoning. Poison was a well-known and frequently used political weapon in the medieval period and beyond. It was the silent, subtle tool of assassins, a way to eliminate rivals, inconvenient heirs, or troublesome political figures, without the mess and outcry of open violence. The history of royal courts is full of whispers, accusations and confirmed cases of death by poisoned chalice or tainted meal. Given this very real and widespread threat, the employment of food tasters was a grim necessity in many royal households. This practice involved a designated individual whose job it was to sample every dish and every drink before it was served to the monarch or prince. Their function was starkly simple. If the taster didn't fall ill or drop dead shortly after consumption, the food was deemed safe for royal eating. However, this system wasn't foolproof, especially against slow-acting poisons that might take hours or even days to show symptoms, by which time the prince would have long since finished his meal. The Roman Emperor Claudius, for instance, was allegedly poisoned and died in AD 54, despite having a dedicated food taster. The very existence of food tasters, these human guinea pigs, underscores the constant, deadly threat that hung over every royal meal. Imagine being a young prince, sitting down to eat, and having to watch someone else take the first bite of your food, every single time, day after day. It would be a perpetual, unnerving reminder that someone, somewhere, might actively be trying to kill you through the most basic act of survival. This would inevitably instill a deep-seated paranoia and distrust concerning not just the food itself, but also everyone involved in its preparation and service. The cooks, the servers, even fellow diners. The elaborate and highly spiced nature of upper-class medieval cuisine could also, ironically, have made spotting poisons more difficult. The typical medieval noble palate favored complex, often sweet-sour flavors, achieved through a potent combination of ingredients like verjuice, a sour juice from unripe grapes, wine, vinegar, and a dazzling array of expensive spices such as black pepper, saffron, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg, often sweetened with copious amounts of honey or sugar. While delicious, these strong and complex flavors could potentially have masked the taste or smell of certain poisonous substances, making the job of the food taster, and the safety of the prince, even more shaky. This normalization of paranoia around something as fundamental as eating would create an environment where a prince could never fully trust what he consumed. It would link a basic biological need, hunger, with a constant, hidden threat, poison. This could lead to persistent anxiety around mealtimes, a deep suspicion of those who handled his food, and a general atmosphere of fear and distrust that soaked into even the most mundane aspects of his daily life. Every meal was a potential gamble with death. So you're essentially living in a gilded fishbowl, meticulously carved from cold, unyielding stone, surrounded by a glittering array of people who might, at any given moment, be enthusiastically plotting your untimely demise, perhaps even while complimenting your choice of doublet over dessert. Fun, right? A truly relaxing childhood. But if the winding court politics, and the decidedly dodgy canaps, somehow fail to send you to the great feasting hall in the sky, don't you worry your little princely head. There's a whole other thrilling level of peril waiting patiently for you. A danger that arises purely and simply because of who you are, because of the royal blood coursing through your veins. Being the heir to the throne, you see, isn't just a fancy title that gets you the biggest drumstick at banquets. In the medieval world, it's like having a giant, sparkly, diamond-encrusted target painted squarely on your back. And everyone, it seems, has a crossbow aimed your way. As the heir to a medieval throne, your very existence, your every breath, was a profound political statement. And, more often than not, it was also a huge political problem for someone, somewhere. You were less a cherished child, and more a high-stakes chess piece in a deadly game. The path to the crown was rarely smooth. Succession conflicts were the bread and butter, or perhaps the poisoned wine and daggers, of medieval monarchies. Numerous contenders, legitimate or otherwise, were constantly fighting for the ultimate prize, leading to long periods of unrest, civil strife, and outright war. The high status of an heir apparent, the very thing that defined your life, ironically exposed you to the gravest dangers. Rightful heirs like yourself were frequently seen not as the natural successors, but as inconvenient obstacles by ambitious rivals. Uncles, cousins, powerful nobles with a weak claim, or even opportunistic foreign powers. And in the ruthless math of medieval power, obstacles were something to be removed, often through the most extreme and permanent measures. The pressure to be the heir, to be born male and healthy, was immense from the moment of your conception. But once you had successfully cleared that first hurdle, the pressure to simply survive to inherit became even more intense, a daily battle against unseen enemies and unpredictable fates. The heir to the throne represented the vital continuity of the dynasty, and, by extension, the perceived stability of the entire kingdom. You were the keystone in the arch of monarchical power. However, to those individuals with rival claims, simmering resentments, or simply driven by naked ambition, you, the heir, were the primary, most significant obstacle standing between them and the throne. This dual role placed you, the prince, in an exceptionally shaky and unpleasant position. On one hand, you were, at least in theory, the most protected individual in the realm, the focus of dynastic hopes and prayers. On the other hand, you were simultaneously the most targeted, the living embodiment of a prize that others coveted fiercely enough to kill for. Your life was a constant, nerve-wracking balancing act, caught between being the shining hope of your dynasty and the prime target for its myriad enemies, both those lurking outside the castle walls and, more terrifyingly, those sharing your dinner table within them. And often, the most dangerous vipers in that nest were those who shared your own blood. Betrayal by close family members. Your dearest uncle, your ambitious older or younger brother, your power-hungry cousin, was a tragically common theme in the bloody story of medieval power struggles. The classic, and perhaps most infamous, example of this is the tragic story of the Princes in the Tower, young King Edward V, aged just 12, and his even younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, who was merely 9. These two boys were the sons of King Edward IV of England. Upon their father's death, their paternal uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who would soon become King Richard III, was appointed as Lord Protector. In a swift and ruthless series of moves, Richard had the boys declared illegitimate, thereby cancelling their claim to the throne, and then had them confined to the formidable Tower of London, supposedly for their own safety. They were seen playing in the Tower Garden a few times, and then they vanished. What most historians agree on is that they were murdered, most likely on the direct orders of their loving uncle Richard, who needed them permanently out of the way to secure his own newly stolen crown. Their fate serves as a stark and horrifying reminder of the dangers faced by young heirs. Nor was this an isolated incident. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine VI was overthrown, captured and brutally blinded by his own mother, the Empress Irene, who desired power for herself. Across the English Channel, King Henry II of England faced repeated, armed rebellions from his own sons, who were impatient for power and territory. And when his son Richard I, the Lionheart, finally did inherit the throne, his own brother John, later King John of Lackland and Magna Carta fame, treacherously tried to steal it while Richard was away on crusade and later held for ransom. Further east, in the chaotic politics of Kievan Rus's, Yaroslav the Wise, in his quest to become Grand Prince, is said to have eliminated several of his own brothers during a brutal civil war. There's a grim medieval saying that there is nothing worse for a medieval ruler than to have a brother or a cousin, because those very relatives, with their shared bloodline and plausible claims to power, were the ones most likely to challenge for the throne. In the dynastic systems of medieval Europe, where succession was so closely tied to blood, your closest relatives often posed the most significant and immediate political threat. They had the lineage, they had the access to the court, they understood the intricate power dynamics, and they often had their own groups of supporters. Trust within the royal family was a rare, precious, and exceedingly fragile thing. The people who, by rights, should have been your strongest protectors and most loyal allies could, with alarming ease and frequency, become your most dangerous and ruthless enemies. This created an environment of profound, almost unbearable, insecurity and suspicion that would soak into your earliest years and shape your entire worldview. Every smile from a relative had to be examined, every offer of help weighed for hidden motives. Given this charming family dynamic, it's hardly surprising that the disappearing act, the sudden, convenient, and often mysterious removal of inconvenient princes, was a recurring theme in medieval history. Assassination, whether open or secret, was a common and often brutally effective tool for eliminating heirs who stood in the way of someone else's ambition. The story of the princes in the tower is the classic, chilling example of this. The Italian chronicler Dominic Mancini, who was present in England at the time, reported that the young, imprisoned Edward V, sensing his impending doom, practiced daily confession and penance, because he believed he was about to die. His fear was, tragically, well-founded. Poisoning, as we've already discussed, was a particularly favored method for dispatching unwanted individuals, due to its subtlety and the difficulty in proving who was to blame. The political context of using poison to neutralize opponents or eliminate influential figures is abundantly clear, and an heir was often the most influential and inconvenient figure of all to a rival. The phenomenon of lost heirs, where young royals simply vanished from the historical record or died under circumstances that smelled of foul play, was a disturbingly common theme. Sometimes, their removal was made easier by legal or quasi-legal means. The legal status of an heir could be challenged, often through carefully arranged accusations of illegitimacy, as was the case with Edward V and his brother. Once declared illegitimate, they were stripped of their rights and protections, making them far easier to sideline, imprison, or eliminate, without a major public outcry. Young princes were particularly vulnerable to such schemes. They were physically weaker, less experienced in the brutal games of power politics, and often entirely dependent on guardians or protectors, who might, in fact, have their own treacherous agendas. Their removal was often a brutally practical, if morally reprehensible, step for ambitious rivals, seeking to consolidate power or resolve a messy succession dispute. The methods of removal could be direct and violent, such as outright murder, or more hidden and deniable, such as deliberate neglect leading to illness and death, carefully arranged accidents, or the aforementioned declarations of illegitimacy that effectively erased them from the line of succession. The chilling frequency of such events indicates that a medieval prince's childhood was lived under a constant, credible, and often terrifying death threat. This threat frequently came not from distant enemies, but from those closest to him, those who shared his lineage and his home. This grim reality would inevitably overshadow any sense of security, privilege, or entitlement that his royal birth might otherwise have granted. Now, amidst this delightful backdrop of potential family assassination and political intrigue, let's talk about love and marriage, or rather, let's talk about the medieval royal equivalent, which was almost always a purely political transaction, probably with someone you'd never laid eyes on before your wedding day, and whose main attraction was the size of their dowry or the strategic importance of their father's alliance. Romance, affection. Those were charming notions for poets and peasants, not for princes whose marriages were forged in the cold fires of statecraft. Royal marriages in the medieval period were almost exclusively political tools. They were designed to forge alliances between kingdoms, to strengthen dynastic power, to secure peace treaties, or to gain valuable territories. Love, personal preference, or even basic compatibility were rarely, if ever, primary considerations. You as a prince were a commodity, a bargaining chip in the high-stakes game of international relations. Princesses, and by extension the princes they were destined to marry, were often promised in marriage at an astonishingly young age, sometimes as mere children, to seal these crucial political alliances. Isabella of France, for instance, was married at the tender age of 12. It was not uncommon for a young princess to be sent to her future husband's court years before the marriage could even happen, so she could be educated in the customs and language of her new land, and to ensure the alliance held firm. You, as the prince, likely wouldn't meet your future spouse until all the complex negotiations were finished, and the marriage contracts signed, sealed, and delivered. Or perhaps you'd have a brief, highly chaperoned meeting during some formal court event, where you'd exchange polite, stiff greetings while your respective families sized each other up. The journey of a medieval princess to her new court, often across vast and dangerous distances, to marry a prince she'd never met, was a significant and often daunting undertaking. She would typically be accompanied by a group of diplomats, advisors and attendants, but rarely by her own parents. Imagine the anxiety, the uncertainty, the loneliness for both people involved in such a transaction. You, the prince, waiting for the arrival of a foreign bride, chosen for you by your father or his council, knowing that your future, and the future of your family line, depended on this stranger. And what was the primary duty of this politically engineered marriage, once it was finally made official? For the princess, and indeed for you the prince, it was singular and stark: to produce heirs, healthy heirs, and preferably male ones, to continue the dynasty and secure the succession. Your marriage bed was less a place of passion, and more a place where the dynasty was forged. For a medieval prince then, marriage was not an expression of personal affection, or a quest for companionship, but another critical component of statecraft, another solemn duty to be performed for the good of the realm, and the continuation of your family's power. This effectively made one of the most significant human relationships impersonal, turning it into yet another source of immense pressure and potential conflict. Your personal life, your emotional fulfillment in marriage, were entirely secondary to the cold, hard demands of political usefulness. You might find yourself bound for life to someone you actively disliked, someone with whom you had no shred of compatibility, or someone whose foreign customs and attendance created constant friction within your own court, all for the good of the realm. This often led to unhappy, loveless marriages, an increase in royal mistresses and bastards, which created their own set of political complications, and further layers of court intrigue, especially if the marriage failed to produce the all-important male heir in a timely fashion. Your happily ever after was more likely to be politically useful ever after, until a better alliance presents itself, or one of you dies of boredom or a badly cooked eel. Alright, so let's recap your princely progress thus far. Your own family might be subtly, or not so subtly, trying to bump you off to clear their own path to the throne, and your future spouse is almost certainly a complete stranger, hand-picked for you based on a complex calculation of territorial gains and diplomatic leverage, rather than, say, a shared interest in falconry, or a compatible sense of humor. It's a stressful, high-stakes existence, to put it mildly, but hey, if you somehow manage to dodge the poisoned chalice at the wedding feast, sidestep the assassin's blade lurking in the castle corridors, and successfully navigate the treacherous, emotionally barren waters of an arranged marriage designed purely for political profit, there's always the glorious character-building prospect of actual war to look forward to. That's right, it's time to trade your dusty textbooks for a much heavier, and considerably more dangerous, sword and shield. Because your illustrious military career is about to begin, probably before you've even finished puberty, or figured out how to shave without assistance. To arms, young prince. Or, more accurately, to a lifetime of potential dismemberment. One of the more startling aspects of a medieval prince's upbringing was the astonishingly early age at which he could be thrust into positions of military command, or at least into the heart of military affairs. Forget waiting until you were a seasoned adult. In the medieval world, your apprenticeship in warfare began practically as soon as you could hold a weapon without dropping it on your own foot too often. The legendary Edward, the Black Prince, a name synonymous with medieval military skill, played a key, even decisive role in the English victory at the Battle of Crcy, when he was a mere 16 years old. That's an age when most modern teenagers are stressing about exams, or trying to get a date. He was commanding a division against the French army, and he wasn't an exception. Henry V, another English king famed for his military victories, was fighting as Henry of Monmouth at the bloody Battle of Shrewsbury, when he too was just 16. Going back even further, Richard I, the Lionheart, was already leading armies and quelling rebellions in his Duchy of Aquitaine at the same tender age. While 14 might have been considered a bit on the young side for an independent field command with ultimate responsibility, it certainly wasn't unheard of for a prince of that age to be given significant administrative duties related to a military campaign, or to be present on or near the battlefield as a page or squire, soaking up the brutal lessons of war firsthand. Formal military education often started around the age of 7 or 8, with a more intensive beginning around 13 or 14. Why this early immersion in the bloody business of war? Several factors were at play. Firstly, a king's legitimacy and his authority over his often unruly nobles frequently rested heavily on his perceived status as a capable warrior and a decisive commander. War was the ultimate test of kingship. Sending a young prince on campaign, even in a command role in name only, served to establish a sense of continuity in leadership. It showed the world, and more importantly, the kingdom's potential enemies and restless barons, that the dynasty had a future, a capable successor, ready to take the reins. It also provided invaluable, if terrifying, learning opportunities for the young prince himself. Of course, it's crucial to understand that a 14 or 16-year-old prince, no matter how clever or well-trained, wouldn't actually be making all the critical strategic and tactical decisions on his own. He would always be surrounded, guided, and probably quite firmly managed by a council of older, experienced military advisors and seasoned commanders. They were the ones truly calling the shots. However, the prince's physical presence on the campaign, his visibility to the troops, was of immense importance. It served as a powerful symbol of royal authority, a rallying point for the soldiers, and a significant boost to morale, especially if he displayed courage and a willingness to share their hardships. This practice of placing young, often teenage, princes in positions of nominal military command was, therefore, a high-risk, high-reward political and dynastic strategy. The rewards were clear. It polished the prince's warrior reputation, provided him with essential experience, demonstrated his fitness to rule, and helped to solidify the succession in the eyes of both allies and enemies. However, the risks were equally stark. It exposed the valuable heir, the future of the dynasty, to the extreme dangers of disease, accident, capture, or death on the battlefield. This medieval acceptance of placing the heir in harm's way underscores a worldview where the potential for glory, the acquisition of vital experience, and the solidification of the royal line often outweighed the personal safety of the individual prince. His life, from a very young age, was always in service to, and frequently at the mercy of, the overarching interests of the state and the dynasty. It also highlights the critical reliance on those older, seasoned commanders who were tasked with the dual responsibility of actually winning the battle, while also, hopefully, keeping the boy prince alive to see another day. So you're a teenage prince, nominally in charge of a few thousand grumpy, heavily armed men. What exactly are you supposed to know about warfare? Your education would have included a healthy dose of military theory, such as it was. You might have studied classical military texts, or you might have learned through the more practical if brutal method of observing experienced commanders and listening to the fireside tales of grizzled veterans. Medieval warfare was a far more complex beast than just lining up and charging. It involved a sophisticated interplay of different types of troops: the stalwart infantry, the missile troops, archers with their deadly longbows, and crossbowmen with their powerful armor-piercing bolts, and of course, the iconic heavily armored knights on their warhorses. Full-scale battles, those glorious decisive clashes you read about in stories, were actually relatively rare. Sieges were far more common. Why? Because for a major battle to occur, both sides generally had to be willing to fight, and both had to believe they had a decent chance of winning. A commander who felt his army was weaker, or the terrain unfavorable, could often avoid a full-scale battle by retreating to a fortified position, or simply refusing to engage. The famed cavalry charge, where a line of knights thundered across the field with lances tucked under their arms, was indeed a key, and often devastating tactic, but its success was heavily dependent on various factors. The nature of the terrain. A muddy field could turn a glorious charge into a bogged-down disaster. The discipline of the charging knights, and the formation and morale of the enemy they were facing. Well-disciplined formations of pikemen, presenting a bristling hedge of spear points, or massed longbowmen, capable of unleashing a storm of arrows, could often break up or destroy a cavalry charge before it even reached its target. Command and control on a medieval battlefield were basic by modern standards, relying on a racket of drums, the blare of trumpets, the waving of banners and flags, and a great deal of shouting. Getting orders to different parts of your army in the heat and chaos of battle was a monumental challenge. The reality of medieval warfare, therefore, was often a far cry from the neat diagrams and chivalric ideals you might have studied. It was frequently a brutal, messy and chaotic affair, often involving less glorious tactics like raiding enemy territory, terrorizing civilian populations to undermine morale and resources, and engaging in long, miserable sieges designed to starve an enemy into submission. While your princely education might have filled your head with stirring tales of chivalry and honor, the actual experience of medieval warfare would quickly rid you of such romantic notions. It was often a chaotic, brutal, and decidedly unglamorous business, frequently involving tactics that had little to do with honor and much to do with grim necessity. Raids into enemy territory weren't about noble duels. They were about burning crops, looting villages, and capturing livestock to deny resources to your opponent and enrich your own side. Sieges, the most common form of medieval warfare, were often long, drawn-out and miserable affairs, a contest of endurance, engineering, and often starvation and disease. As a young prince leading troops, you would be confronted with this harsh reality very quickly. The clash between the chivalric ideals you were taught and the brutal, often morally questionable necessities of actual war could be a significant psychological shock. It would force you to adapt, to make hard choices, perhaps even to order actions like the targeting of civilian resources or, in extreme cases, massacres of captured populations. Decisions that would weigh heavily on any commander, let alone a young one still finding his way. Now imagine the moment. The pre-battle tension, the smell of fear and horsesweat, the glint of sun on thousands of steel helmets. And then, the order comes, or perhaps you give it yourself, your voice cracking with a mixture of adrenaline and terror. Charge! Leading a charge into the heart of an enemy formation was the ultimate expression of a warrior's courage, particularly for a king or a prince. It was expected. Kings and high nobles were supposed to lead from the front, to be seen by their men, to inspire them with their own courage and skill, and to demonstrate that they were willing to share the same dangers. This wasn't just good leadership, it was often seen as part of their God-given role, their sacred duty as protectors of their realm. A charge was a full-speed offensive maneuver, an attempt to crash into the enemy lines at maximum speed, and engage in decisive, brutal close combat. The shock value of a well-executed cavalry charge, with knights holding their lances couched, tucked firmly under the arm to transfer the full momentum of horse and rider into the impact, was a significant, and often battle-winning tactic throughout the Middle Ages. It could shatter enemy formations, sow panic, and create the breakthrough needed for victory. However, Placing yourself at the very tip of that charging spear was an incredibly dangerous proposition. While as a prince you would undoubtedly be surrounded by your most loyal and skilled household knights, your elite bodyguard all sworn to protect you with their lives, you were still plunging headlong into the thickest, most violent part of the fighting. Horses, even highly trained war horses, might refuse to charge directly into a dense, unbroken wall of enemy spears or a hail of arrows. If your charge faltered, or if the enemy line held, you could find yourself isolated, surrounded, and fighting for your life against overwhelming odds. For a medieval prince, leading a charge was far more than just a tactical decision. It was a critical public performance of his fitness to rule, his legitimacy, and his courage. It embodied the cherished ideal of the warrior king, the leader who did not merely send his men into danger, but faced it alongside them. This act was essential for maintaining the loyalty and respect of his soldiers, the fealty of his nobles, and the very legitimacy of his future reign. However, it also placed you, the prince, in a position of extreme and immediate personal danger. This willingness to risk mutilation or death at the very head of your men was a crucial, albeit terrifying aspect of proving your princely worth and securing your political future. Failure to display such courage, or a perceived reluctance to engage in the fight, could be interpreted as cowardice, fatally undermining your authority and your claim to leadership. It was the ultimate gamble, where your life was the stake. So you've led the charge, miraculously avoided being turned into a princely kebab, and the battle, for better or worse, is over. What if, despite your valor, or perhaps because of it if you charged a bit too enthusiastically into the wrong part of the enemy line, you find yourself on the losing side, and, horror of horrors, captured? Well, welcome to the medieval equivalent of a very high-stakes, very uncomfortable extended stay at an enemy's hospitality suite. Capture was a very real and frequent possibility for medieval nobles and royalty who participated in warfare. King John II of France, for instance, had the misfortune of being taken prisoner by the English at the Battle of Poitiers. Even the legendary Richard I, the Lionheart of England, was captured not in battle, but while trying to sneak home from the Crusades, and held for a hefty sum. Generally speaking, if you were a captured noble or, even better, a prince or a king, you weren't likely to be summarily executed on the spot. Why? Because you were, quite literally, worth your weight in gold, or at least a very large pile of silver. Ransoming high-status prisoners was a very profitable business for the captors. The sums involved could be astronomical, capable of funding future wars, building castles, or simply enriching the pockets of the victorious lord or king. King Richard I's ransom was set at a staggering 100,000 to 150,000 silver marks, a sum estimated to be 2 or 3 times the entire annual income of the English crown at the time. King John II of France's ransom after Poitiers was an eye-watering 3 million gold crowns. Raising these huge ransoms placed an immense financial burden on the captive's kingdom. It often required the levying of new and unpopular taxes on an already struggling population, and could lead to significant social unrest, economic hardship, and even political instability back home. The process of negotiating and paying the ransom could drag on for years, during which time you, the captive prince, would remain a guest of your enemies. Sometimes, however, if a captive was deemed too politically important or too dangerous to be released even for a fortune, they might be held indefinitely for purely political reasons, rather than being ransomed. Charles of Orléans, captured at Agincourt, was kept a prisoner in England for 24 years, because he was considered too significant a leader of a rival French faction to be allowed to return. So, your value as a captive was a double-edged sword. While awaiting the arrival of your ransom payment, which could take a very, very long time. Your conditions as a noble captive were generally expected to be reasonable, at least by medieval standards. You wouldn't be languishing in a filthy dungeon with the common prisoners. You'd likely be held in a castle, perhaps under house arrest, with a degree of comfort and freedom of movement, though always under guard. However, exceptions certainly existed, and the quality of your hospitality could vary greatly depending on the mood and resources of your captors, or the political climate. The capture of a prince in battle, therefore, instantly transformed you from a military leader into an incredibly valuable political and economic asset for your enemies. The ransom negotiations that followed were not simple financial transactions, they were complex diplomatic dances, full of intrigue and power plays. Your freedom, and quite possibly the financial health of your own kingdom, depended on the successful outcome of these high-stakes dealings. You became, in essence, a very expensive pawn in a much larger game, your personal fate hanging in the balance while kingdoms haggled over your price. It was another layer of immense pressure and profound uncertainty in your already shaky princely life. Let's assume you've made it through the battle, either victorious or perhaps ransomed and returned. A little poorer, but wiser. The immediate danger is past, but the consequences linger, often for a lifetime. Surviving medieval warfare frequently meant living with the permanent souvenirs of combat, physical scars. A jagged line across your cheek from a sword cut, a limp from a badly healed leg wound, missing fingers. These were the common visible reminders of your warrior efforts. Some scars might be worn with pride, symbols of courage and experience. Others, particularly ugly facial injuries, could carry a social stigma, a mark of vulnerability, or even shame in a society that placed a high value on physical wholeness and a warrior's appearance. But the wounds weren't just physical. The psychological trauma of experiencing the sheer brutality, chaos, and terror of a medieval battlefield, witnessing the deaths of comrades, perhaps even taking lives yourself, would have undoubtedly left deep mental scars as well. Many medieval warriors likely suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress. Contemporary writers described how knights could be beset by great terrors during the night, plagued by nightmares and flashbacks. Other accounts mention warriors suffering from acute stress, oversensitivity to noise, depression, and problems with substance abuse, all consistent with trauma. While it's true that medieval society was generally more violent and accustomed to hardship than our own, this didn't necessarily make people immune to the profound psychological impact of warfare's horrors. Seeing your friends cut down, killing enemies in brutal hand-to-hand combat, the constant fear of death or mutilation. These experiences are inherently traumatic, regardless of the time period. For a prince, who might also bear the burden of command and responsibility for the lives of his men, the psychological toll could be even greater. Beyond the personal scars, both physical and mental, the political fallout of your performance in battle could be enormous and far-reaching. A decisive victory could bring immense glory, territorial gains, the capture of high-value prisoners, and crippling ransom demands that could destabilize an enemy kingdom for years to come. Your reputation as a successful warrior prince would be solidified, enhancing your authority and your claim to the throne. Conversely, a defeat could be a disaster. It could mean the loss of vital territories, a shattering blow to your kingdom's prestige and resources, widespread political instability, and even the potential end of your dynasty if the losses were severe enough. The actions and decisions of a prince on the battlefield, his courage or perceived cowardice, his tactical skill or disastrous blunders, could directly and profoundly impact not only his own future, but the very fate and future of his entire kingdom. Therefore, even if you, as a medieval prince, managed to survive the immediate dangers of warfare, you would inevitably carry the lifelong burdens of your command. The physical injuries might heal into scars, but the chronic pain could linger. The psychological trauma might be suppressed, but it could shape your personality and decision-making for the rest of your days. And the political consequences of your victories or defeats would ripple outwards for generations. War was not a chapter in your life. It was a severe test that would forge, and quite possibly break, the man you became, and the king you might one day be. So you've somehow managed to charge headlong into the terrifying, chaotic fray of medieval battle, probably acquiring a few impressive new scars to either proudly display at court, or discreetly hide under your tunic, depending on how embarrassing the story behind them actually is. You might have even had the distinct pleasure of bankrupting your entire kingdom by having your father pay your exorbitant ransom after a less than stellar military outing. You're exhausted, you're almost certainly traumatized, but against all statistical probability you're alive. You might even, by some miracle of survival and dynastic attrition, be on the very cusp of inheriting the crown. Finally, you think, the good life is about to begin. No more cold castles, no more suspicious uncles, no more lectures on the proper way to gut an enemy. Right? Well, about that. You've made it. Against all odds. Through a childhood that resembled an advanced obstacle course designed by sadists. An education that prioritized pain tolerance over poetry. And a military career that was statistically more likely to end in a shallow grave than a glorious coronation. You are finally king. The crown is on your head. The trumpets have blared. The people have, hopefully, cheered. Your reward for this lifetime of suffering and survival. To take the reins of a kingdom that is, in all likelihood, absolutely full of every single one of the delightful problems, dangers, discomforts, and political instabilities that you've just spent your entire young life desperately trying to navigate and endure. Congratulations, Your Majesty. You've graduated from being a target to being the biggest target. You'll still face the constant simmering threat of rebellion from disgruntled nobles who think they could do a better job, or who simply don't like the cut of your new royal style. The viper's nest of court intrigue doesn't magically disappear just because you're wearing the crown. If anything, it becomes even more venomous, with groups now fighting for your royal favor, or plotting your royal downfall. The potential for assassination, which haunted your princely days, is now an even more pressing concern, because as king, you are the ultimate obstacle to someone else's ambition, and the relentless, soul-crushing need to maintain power, to balance competing interests, to dispense justice, or at least the appearance of it, and to keep the kingdom from imploding will consume your every waking moment. And lest you think your personal comforts will improve, remember, the castle is still drafty, cold and damp. The sanitation system still primarily involves a hole and a long drop into the moat. And if you get sick, which you inevitably will, you're still at the mercy of physicians whose primary tools are leeches, laxatives, and a worrying enthusiasm for drilling holes in your skull. The prize of kingship, it turns out, is not an escape from the hardships of your princely life, but rather a major escalation of responsibility and stress, all played out within the same perilous, uncomfortable and fundamentally hostile medieval environment. The crown is less a symbol of ultimate triumph, and more a mark of ultimate unending burden. You've simply traded one set of anxieties for a much larger, heavier and more jewel-encrusted set. And what's the very first, most urgent order of business now that you're the big boss, the king, the ruler of all you survey? Why, it's to secure the succession, of course. The crushing dynastic pressure that you felt weighing down on you as an heir. The constant anxiety about your own survival and ability to continue the line, is now your pressure to produce an heir. The cycle begins anew, with you now in the uncomfortable role previously occupied by your own worn-out father. You need a healthy male heir, naturally. And probably a spare, or even two, because you, more than anyone, understand the appallingly high rates of infant mortality that plagued the medieval world. You know firsthand the myriad dangers, the diseases, the accidents, the political plotting that await any young prince. The survival of your dynasty, the peace of your kingdom, now rests on the reproductive success of your queen, and the subsequent survival of your offspring. Through the same perilous gauntlet you somehow endured, you'll find yourself scrutinizing your own children for signs of robust health, praying they make it through their first perilous years, and all the while, you'll be acutely aware of the political implications of every sniffle, every fever, every childhood fall. And in a particularly cruel twist of irony, you will now be the one arranging politically useful marriages for your own children, using them as pawns in the complex game of international diplomacy and dynastic power building, just as you were used. You will continue the very system that made your own youth so fraught with anxiety and devoid of personal choice. Your survival and ascent to the throne don't break the cycle, they merely ensure its continuation. There is, it seems, no escape from the relentless grinding machinery of medieval dynastic politics. You've won the game, only to become its new game master, forced to subject the next generation to its brutal rules, so there you have it. Your whirlwind, and frankly rather depressing, tour of why being a medieval prince was significantly less charming and considerably more alarming than any storybook would have you believe. From the moment of your high-pressure, highly public birth, through a childhood spent dodging disease and daggers in a drafty castle, an education that felt more like boot camp, a court life riddled with smiling enemies, and a military career that was a masterclass in organized violence and personal terror. Your existence was a relentless onslaught of dangers. Disease, accidents, brutal training regimens, political backstabbing, the horrors of war, and the sheer, unadulterated discomfort of daily life were your constant companions. The romantic, idealized image of the medieval prince, the gallant hero, the wise ruler-in-waiting, the recipient of adoring gazes and luxurious comforts, is, as we've seen, a far cry from the grim, often terrifying, reality. You were, from the moment you drew your first breath, a political pawn, your life dictated by the needs of the state and the ambitions of others. You were constantly at risk, with very little personal freedom, choice, or even basic physical comfort. Survival in this world often meant becoming hardened, ruthless, perpetually vigilant, and perhaps emotionally stunted. Was the distant glimmer of a crown, the ultimate prize, truly worth the monumental personal cost? For most, the answer would likely be a resounding, if whispered, probably not. Even the boring life of a medieval peasant, with its own undeniable list of hardships, the back-breaking labor, the meager food, the constant threat of famine and disease, seems almost preferable in some respects. While a peasant's life was undoubtedly harsh, a prince's life, though materially better in terms of food, clothing and shelter, however imperfect, came with a unique and arguably more terrifying set of threats to their very existence, often coming from the very people who should have been his protectors. The peasant feared the Lord's wrath or a bad harvest. The prince feared his uncle's ambition, his brother's jealousy, the assassin's poison, and the weight of an entire kingdom's expectations. Ultimately, the cumulative weight of all these explored dangers and profound hardships suggests that the life of a medieval prince, despite its perceived glamour and historical significance, was an overwhelmingly negative and undesirable experience by modern standards. And, one suspects, it was likely viewed with a similar degree of fear by many people at the time, had they truly understood the full, princely package, and been given a choice. The glittering Game of Thrones was, for most of its young princely players, a losing game, even if, against all odds, they somehow managed to win, and survive to wear the crown. The real problem with the princely package was that even success meant a continuation, and often an amplification, of the suffering. So if you've made it this far into our little historical horror story, without developing a sympathetic case of the medieval gout, an irrational fear of overly ambitious uncles, or a sudden craving for a heavily fortified, centrally heated apartment with good plumbing, well done you. You have the constitution of a true survivor. If you found this journey into the manifold miseries of medieval royalty strangely soothing, or at least distracting enough to lull you towards the land of Nod, please do hit that like button. It really does help the channel more than you know. And if you haven't already, and you enjoy these deep dives into the less than glamorous realities of the past, consider subscribing. We're still on that valiant quest for 1,000 subscribers, so we can keep digging up these delightfully grim historical nightmares for your listening pleasure. Every click brings us closer to our goal. Before you drift off, let me know in the comments what particular aspect of medieval princely life you think would have done you in first. Was it the constant threat of disease, the appalling sanitation, the brutal training, the dodgy food, or perhaps the soul-crushing lack of privacy? For me, I think it's a toss-up between the public birthing ceremonies and the ever-present possibility of being poisoned by a turnip. Thanks for listening, and for joining me on this rather bleak exploration. Sleep tight, try not to dream of plague-ridden castles, treacherous relatives, or the unique aroma of a medieval moat in mid-July. Good night.